Sometimes I am just blown away at the natural colors that actually exist in the sky, especially when those colors not only light up the sky, but they reflect on physical objects. Like when a mountain goes from being brown and green and, whatever mountainy colors to a brilliant shade of pink or blue or purple. Hello, my friend. You made it. It's the last day. It's the last day of my 10-day Painting the Wilderness World of Color Watercolor Challenge. And today we are ending on one of my very, very favorite things to paint. I think that I love to paint mountains so much because it can be a meditative process. You're building up layers a little bit at a time. And I also love it because you don't need to use precision. As you learn about the details and the strokes and the shapes that you gravitate more toward that might do a better job at depicting a mountain, but ultimately you're just making a bunch of texture, a bunch of random texture, and then when you pull away from that texture, suddenly it snaps into place. So without further ado, let's end this challenge with a dreamy mountain adventure. My friend, I am so excited for this one because I think it turned out really cool. And the cool part about this project is I thought I was messing it up right until the very end. And I thought even as I finished that it just did not look how I wanted. And then I looked away and did something else for 5 minutes. And then I looked back and I realized, nope, this works. This works great. And so I'm so excited to show you how I put together this mountain scene. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get to prime our paper with clean water, which is pretty much how I do most of these projects, right? So we're priming our paper with clean water. And the first thing that we're going to do is after getting our water on our page, we're going to mix a kind of coral color. So I'm using Opera Rose with Lemon Yellow Deep. Those are my two favorite colors to mix coral. You don't have to use those colors. A lot of people don't like those colors, and that's fine. But if you don't have opera is trickier to replace. It's like a neon fluorescent pink. A lot of people don't like opera because it's not light fast, but I don't really pay attention much to light fast colors. Light fast meaning it will fade in the sun over time. It's not like archival. I would recommend not keeping any artwork in the sun anyway, and I don't imagine my paintings are going to end up in a museum, so I just like using colors that I like to use, and opera is a mixing color I use a lot. So one of the reasons I got my page wet first and then mixed my coral color with opera and lemon yellow deep is because now my paper is wet, but it's not soaking, right? It's just kind of damp. And so with my size 10 brush, I'm just kind of flickering on like a cloud texture of this pink coral color. One of the reasons that I like lemon yellow deep is because it granulates, which means that once this dries, there's gonna be little bits of like yellow glimmering through. So I'm putting clouds in the sky, and then I'm putting some areas of pink in the bottom of the mountain, and you'll see how it all comes together. If painting cloud texture like this is very uncomfortable for you, that's okay. It's okay. You just have to paint blobs, making sure to leave pockets of white space. The whole idea is we're painting like wispy blobs with pockets of white space because we're going to paint the blue around the clouds so that the blue is going to help us create like a silver lining around the clouds. So instead of using the lifting technique like we used in Gray Lake, this is one way that you can paint clouds and still get that silver lining. So I painted those clouds. I left behind pockets of white space, right? And then before I paint anything, I'm actually going to give myself an outline for where the mountain is going to go. So some of those pink spaces that I painted are going to be part of the mountain. And so I'm starting just like on that left side and then gradually sloping upward in that kind of like, broken mountain ridge area. And then I'm re-wetting the sky with clean water because we're still going to be using the wet on wet technique here. Basically, like I said, we're going to paint the blue around the clouds. And if you feel like your paint is going everywhere. You're just gonna paint on top of the clouds. That's where a thirsty brush comes in. So I'm gonna show you exactly how we're gonna do this. So I'm using Idanthrene Blue, and I added a little bit of Quinacridone Rose to get it more like a blue violet. But as you can see, it came on a little more blue violet than I intended, so I added a little bit of cerulean to it, mostly because cerulean was already on my palette. But so whatever color you use, I'm going for like a warm blue, right? A blue that's kind of veering on blue violet, but not quite violet. And I dropped some pigment on there, and then I switched. I had a size 10 and I realized that's not going to work. So I switched to a size 6 so that I would have more control over where the paint was going to go. And so I could use a drier brush. So once I dropped the pigment on, and remember my paper's already wet, right? Once I dropped the pigment on, now I'm basically using a thirsty brush to move the pigment toward the clouds so that I'm kind of painting around the clouds and leaving behind this white liner around some of the clouds. And I'm just painting in between the white spaces so that I'm capturing this like layer of clouds, but also capturing the blue sky that's around it. If at any point you're trying this technique and the blue kind of gets away from you and goes into the clouds, that's okay. If what you get, instead of these very pink clouds with a blue sky, if what you get isn't that, but instead it is, just like violet and blue and pink mixtures all over, that's fine. That's totally okay. But you can also use a thirsty brush to lift. It's also important to know like why things might be happening. Like if your color is kind of exploding, maybe you have too much water. If you're creating dried paint lines, it means your page isn't wet enough. So this is all about water control. And if you try doing it and you realize this is hard, it is. This is a tricky technique. And so that's okay. I'm pushing you, but also I want you to know that there are options. All right. So we have the clouds, we have the sky. I let the sky dry, and then I wet the mountain. So just the mountain is wet with clean water. And then I added more of that like pinkish coral mixture so that there are pockets of this pink space on the mountain. And then I added a little bit of Opera Rose to my Idanthrene Blue cerulean mixture. And I'm adding in pockets so that on the mountain, it's a little bit more violet than it was in the sky. I'm adding in pockets of violet on the mountain. And then I'm adding in more pink, and then I'm using a thirsty brush to take it away. But the end result really is I want some pockets of pink and some pockets of blue violet. So that is what we're going for. Light value is always better here. It's always better to start light, and then you can add more color later if that's what you need to do. So it's a lot easier to add darker details and more vibrant details after, as opposed to going too dark right from the beginning. So now I'm going to start adding this mountain texture. And adding the mountain texture is where so many people get tripped up. I am not painting any very specific way. So one kind of like paint random blobs if that's what's going to help you. One guideline that helps me is to think about painting like jagged kind of sideways lines. So like I'm starting from like part of the mountain ridge, and then I'm painting these jagged lines. And I'm using a really, really light value of that same blue violet that I had mixed before. I'm using a light value, meaning watery, with my size 2 brush, and then I'm just kind of feathering it out. Feathering meaning like I'm painting the line, and then I'm going back in and just kind of blending it over, just randomly. So this is random. Right? The one thing that is not random is the pockets of pink space I want to preserve as much as I can. It's okay to cover up some of them, but the pockets of pink space are what are going to be flickering when the whole rest of the mountain is cast in shadow. So if you do anything, If there's one thing that you do on purpose and everything else is random, it's that you want to keep at least a few of those pockets of pink space really clear, and like not have any paint on top of them, so they are bright, so that they can really contrast against the rest of the shadows that we're going to be painting on the mountain. So that first layer of mountain crags that we painted, we used a pretty light value of that like blue violet, right? This next layer, we're going to be painting more dark value, and it's going to be more of this dry brush texture as opposed to like, watery lines and then feathering it. This is more like dry brush from the outset. Now, we don't want this to be like black, right? We don't want it to be like super stark, but we do want it to be pretty dark. So I took a little bit of Galaxy Black from Schminky, and I added a little bit of Indigo to that also, so it's a little bluer. And what we're doing is I put a little bit of water in it so it's a little bit lighter, but I want it to be a dry brush texture right away. I don't want these strokes to be like really a flat wash of this really dark color. So one way that you can do that to make sure you get a dry brush texture right away is to actually paint on your tape or paint on scratch paper so that it takes off excess. So as you can see, I'm just painting like sideways lines, like blobs randomly, painting around some of the pink spaces. I'm painting on top of some pink spaces too, but I am intentionally making sure that there are some pockets of pink space that are entirely free of any paint at all. So I want to preserve some of those. And if you're looking at this and thinking, wow, this is like really stark, it looks out of place, we're going to paint a layer of shadow on top of this, okay? So we painted 2 layers of that dry brush kind of, texture, one really light value cerulean indigo, and then one this darker Galaxy Black indigo color, so that we have some of that stark contrast. And the reason we have that stark contrast is because the other part of the mountain, it's actually snow, right? So the reason that the sky is reflecting so well on this mountain is because it's covered in snow. And so the snow is what's reflecting, right? The snow is reflecting the color. And the little dark spots that we painted with that dry brush, it's the parts of the mountain that aren't covered in snow. So we let that dry, and now we're going to paint the shadows, and this is going to be the scariest part because we're not painting dry brush texture, we're painting with watery paint. This is just straight Idanthrene Blue, okay? This is really watery, but it's still straight Idanthrene Blue on dry paper. And so we're painting on dry paper, and we're painting around these pockets of pink space and some pockets of that lighter space too. Because the idea is a lot of this mountain is going to be cast in shadow, but some of it is not. Some of it is like jutting into the sunlight. Some of it is flickering with this like pink glowy sunlight. And so this is random. We're just painting where we left the pockets of pink space before. We're painting around, and we're using this kind of watery, mid-value, but still watery Idanthrene Blue to paint around these pockets of white space, these pockets of pink space. And we let it dry, and we're gonna do one more round that's just slightly darker. Still watery, the paint is still watery, but so it's still pigment, it's still watery, but we're adding a tiny bit more pigment so this shadow is even darker. And we're going to mostly be painting along the same spaces that we had the previous layer, but this is also an opportunity to kind of use a smaller brush even to add slightly more shadowy details, just like little blobs basically, on some parts of the mountain. So we had these big swashes of shadow, and now I'm going to slowly bring some of the shadow in to the pink spaces, but not a lot, right? Just like a few lines here and there so that it looks a little more natural, so that it looks like there's some kind of natural movement happening in the shadows. But that's it for the mountain. And during this part of the mountain, I was like, I messed it up. It just looks so awkward, but I promise it looks way less awkward than you think it does. So the last part of this project is we're going to paint a moon. And initially I thought maybe we'll paint a crescent moon. And then I thought, I don't know. So instead, what I did was paint a disappearing moon with gouache. So like part of it you can see, it's, I mean, that's what a crescent moon is, right? Is you can see a sliver of it, and then the other part of that sphere disappears, right? It's not as lit up. And so the way that you do that with gouache is you paint like that sliver of moon with white gouache, and then you use just clean water with a small detail brush, and you kind of bring it out, like you blend out that moon so it still forms a circle, but it's slowly blending and disappearing into the sky. So I added that moon just to add a little bit of like to kind of balance out the scene. I don't think you need the moon. You kind of can't even really see it in a lot of the pictures. But I like adding moons just because I think they look cool. So I added it at that top left hand corner because I thought it kind of balanced out the weight of the shadow and the big mountain on that right side. So, okay, things that I loved. I loved the clouds, man. I love painting clouds like this. Remember, the key to painting clouds like that is to make sure that your paper is damp, so it's still wet, but it's not soaking. Because that way, when you kind of gently stroke the pigment onto the paper, it doesn't just like completely overtake the whole page. It mostly stays where it is, but it just blends out a little bit. So I loved painting the clouds with the pigment first and then painting the blue around it. I also love Opera and Lemon Yellow Deep together. I just think it's great. And the shadows on the mountain, that last layer, it just brought everything together for me in a way that I didn't really think was going to work out, but I think that it did. I think I maybe could have left a little bit more light space on the mountain. I think that maybe something different from the moon could balance the sky, like maybe some birds. But other than that, this was just one of my very favorites and a great way to end this challenge. So thank you.